New Year's Eve wrapped the city in a kind of beautiful chaos, the kind that made everything feel louder, brighter, and more important than it really was. Lights blinked from buildings like restless eyes, snow drifted down in slow spirals, and the air buzzed with countdown energy as people rushed toward parties, lovers, and promises they hoped would survive the night. She stood on the edge of it all, not quite part of the celebration, her breath fogging in front of her as she watched strangers laugh as if tomorrow would magically erase their regrets. Midnight was minutes away, and she had nowhere special to be, only the quiet knowledge that another year was ending without her permission. That was when the noise around her seemed to thin, not because the city had gone quiet, but because something heavier had stepped into her awareness. She didn't hear him approach, didn't sense movement, only the sudden feeling that she was no longer alone in her thoughts. When she turned, he was there, tall and composed, dressed in dark layers that made him look carved out of shadow rather than standing in it. The Korean Mafia boss was not a man people missed when he entered a space. His presence bent attention without effort, the way gravity bends light, and even in a crowd full of music and fireworks, he felt separate, untouched. He spoke her name once, calmly, without raising his voice, and it felt louder than the countdown echoing down the street. People nearby didn't stop celebrating, but a few glances shifted, a few shoulders stiffened, subtle signs that others recognized him too and knew better than to stare. He didn't waste time with small talk. He didn't smile. He simply said he was inviting her home with him for New Year. The words themselves were polite, almost ordinary, but coming from him, they landed with weight. It wasn't a question wrapped in charm or pressure, just a statement delivered with quiet certainty, as if the invitation already existed and he was only now making her aware of it. The power imbalance between them was impossible to ignore, written in the way he stood relaxed while her pulse picked up, in the way his calm felt deliberate rather than kind. She knew who he was, what his name carried in whispered conversations and unfinished stories, and that knowledge made her hesitate even as curiosity stirred. Fireworks cracked overhead, splashing color across the snow, and the crowd began the final countdown, voices rising together in anticipation. She searched his face for something reckless or cruel and found neither. His expression was controlled, his gaze steady, as if this moment had been considered long before tonight. She asked why, her voice careful, and he answered without explaining anything at all. He said he didn't like celebrating alone. There was no drama in the admission, no attempt to soften it, just a simple truth offered without defense. That honesty unsettled her more than a threat would have. Around them, people shouted numbers, hugging, kissing, promising forever in the space of a breath, but she felt suspended outside of time, standing between refusal and acceptance. She thought about what it meant to say no to a man like him, about the safety of walking away and never knowing what this invitation truly was. She also thought about what it meant to say yes, to step into a world that didn't need her consent to exist. His politeness felt uneasy, like something sharp hidden under silk, and she sensed a motive he wasn't naming, one he didn't need to. The countdown reached its final seconds, voices colliding in joy, and she realized that whatever choice she made would echo into the next year whether she wanted it to or not. When midnight hit and the city erupted, she heard herself agree. The word left her mouth softly, but it was enough. He nodded once, not surprised, not triumphant, just acknowledging a decision he seemed to have anticipated. The car was waiting nearby, dark and quiet, the door opening smoothly as if on cue. The drive pulled them away from the noise, streets emptying as celebrations blurred past the windows, and the farther they went, the quieter the world became. He didn't fill the silence, didn't ask questions or offer reassurances, and that restraint made her more aware of every thought she couldn't voice. When they arrived, the house stood apart from the city, lights low, security subtle but undeniable. He opened the door for her, still calm, still polite, and as she stepped inside, warmth closed around her, shutting out the cold and the last traces of fireworks. The door slid shut behind them with a soft, final click, and in the sudden stillness, she realized there were no other voices, no signs of a party, no guests waiting to welcome the new year. She was the only one. And as the lock settled into place, the weight of that realization pressed in, heavy and irreversible, and she understood that whatever this night was meant to reveal, there was no turning back now. The moment she crossed the threshold, the world she knew fell away as cleanly as the snow sliding off her coat. The door sealed behind them, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that made the sound linger in her mind longer than it should have. Inside, the air was warm and still, carrying a faint scent of wood and something darker she couldn't place. There were no decorations screaming celebration, no crowded tables or glasses waiting to be raised at midnight. Instead, the space felt deliberately restrained, polished surfaces reflecting soft light, every detail controlled to the point where it stopped feeling luxurious and started feeling intentional. This wasn't a house meant for hosting joy. It was a place designed for order. Her footsteps echoed as she followed him deeper inside, and with each step, she became more aware of the silence, how it wrapped around her and left no room to hide her thoughts. She noticed the security before she noticed anything else, cameras tucked discreetly into corners, doors that looked heavier than necessary, windows reinforced without calling attention to themselves. It was subtle, but it told a clear story. This was not a place where surprises were welcome. He moved through it with ease, every motion unhurried, like a man who had nothing to prove to his own walls. He didn't rush her, didn't gesture for her to sit or stand, didn't explain what this night was meant to be. He simply let her take it in, and she realized that was part of the design too. The quiet forced her to observe, to feel, to question. She found herself scanning the room the way someone does when they know they've stepped somewhere they're not supposed to be, looking for clues about what kind of rules applied here. There were no clocks in sight, nothing counting down the new year, nothing acknowledging that tonight was supposed to matter. The absence of celebration felt louder than fireworks. She wondered if this was how he lived every day, detached from the rhythms that guided everyone else, untouched by tradition or expectation. When she glanced back at him, she caught his eyes already on her, not in a way that felt predatory, but in a way that felt measuring. He was watching her reactions with a focus that made her skin tighten, as if she were answering questions she hadn't been asked yet. She slowed her steps, aware that every breath, every pause was being noticed. He still hadn't spoken, and that silence carried more weight than any interrogation. It made her aware of the power in not explaining yourself, in letting others reveal who they are simply by existing in your space. She reached a room that opened wider than the rest, a living area that should have felt inviting but didn't. The furniture was arranged with precision, not comfort, and the windows looked out over the city without letting any of its noise inside. From here, the fireworks were distant flashes of color, muted and irrelevant. She realized then that this place wasn't built to celebrate endings or beginnings. It was built to endure. Her unease sharpened as she noticed small things that didn't fit the idea of a New Year invitation. No food laid out, no music playing softly in the background, no signs that anyone else would be joining them. The message was clear without being stated. This night was not about marking time. It was about something else entirely. She turned toward him, prepared to ask what he wanted, but the question caught in her throat when she saw his expression. He wasn't impatient. He wasn't cold. He looked thoughtful, as if this moment mattered to him in a way he hadn't expected. That realization unsettled her more than fear ever could. He finally spoke, his voice low and even, filling the room without echo. He told her she could take off her coat, that she could leave it there. The politeness of the suggestion made her hesitate, because it sounded less like hospitality and more like a test. She complied slowly, placing it where he indicated, aware that each small choice felt like crossing another invisible line. The silence returned, heavier now, and she felt the urge to fill it, to say something about the night, the cold, the countdown she'd missed. But she didn't. Something in his presence told her that words would only get in the way. He moved closer, not invading her space, just close enough that she could sense the shift, the way attention narrowed. He studied her face the way someone studies a familiar place that looks different at night, searching for something specific. She wondered what he was looking for and whether she'd already given it away. The house seemed to hold its breath with them, every light steady, every shadow deliberate. When he finally asked his question, it wasn't about where she'd been or what she wanted or how she planned to celebrate the new year. It had nothing to do with the date or the time or the world outside these walls. He asked her something so unexpected, so unrelated to the occasion, that it cut through the tension and replaced it with something colder. In that instant, she understood that this invitation had never been about the holiday at all, and whatever answer he was waiting for would decide far more than how the night ended. She didn't answer him right away, not because she didn't hear the question, but because it reached somewhere inside her that had been quiet for a long time. It forced her to confront why she was standing in his house on a night meant for togetherness when everyone else seemed to belong somewhere else. She had spent most of her life learning how to disappear in plain sight, how to move through rooms without being noticed, and tonight was no different. New Year's Eve had always been the hardest, not because of the noise or the countdown, but because it reminded her of everything she didn't have. Family scattered by circumstance, friendships worn thin by time and disappointment, relationships that never survived the weight of reality. She told herself every year that she didn't need the celebration, that the calendar changing meant nothing, but standing there under his steady gaze, that life felt thinner than ever. She explained carefully that she'd been working late, that she hadn't planned anything special, that being alone felt easier than pretending. Her voice was steady, but her hands gave her away, fingers curling together as if bracing for judgment. He listened without interrupting, without the impatience she expected from a man used to being obeyed. That alone set him apart from the others she'd known, men who filled silence with their own importance, who demanded attention without earning it. She spoke about her life in fragments, not because she wanted to hide it, but because it was all she knew how to offer. A childhood shaped by responsibility too early, by learning to survive rather than dream. A series of choices that made sense at the time but left her standing alone more often than not. She didn't frame herself as a victim, but the vulnerability slipped through anyway, in the way she described being tired of explaining herself, of justifying why she didn't fit neatly into anyone's expectations. New Year's had simply been another reminder of that disconnect, another night where the world celebrated in pairs and groups while she moved on the edges. She admitted that when he invited her, she'd hesitated because she knew what his world represented. Power, danger, temptation, all things she'd learned to avoid. But she'd also been curious, not about him as a man, but about why he'd chosen her. She wasn't like the women who usually surrounded him, the ones who knew how to play the game, who were drawn to status and security like moths to flame. She didn't belong in rooms where deals were made in whispers and loyalty was measured in blood. That difference had always been her shield, the reason she'd stayed out of trouble, but tonight it felt like the very thing that had pulled her into it. He watched her as she spoke, his expression unreadable, but she sensed a shift, a deepening of focus that made her chest tighten. It dawned on her that he wasn't just hearing her story for the first time. He already knew pieces of it. The realization crept in slowly, threading through her words until it became impossible to ignore. When she mentioned where she worked, he nodded as if confirming something. When she spoke about living alone, about routines shaped by caution rather than comfort, his gaze didn't flicker with surprise. It was then that she understood this invitation hadn't been spontaneous. She had caught his attention long before the fireworks, long before the countdown, maybe even long before tonight. The thought sent a chill through her, not of fear, but of vulnerability. Being seen without realizing it was more unsettling than being confronted directly. She paused, the weight of that awareness pressing on her, and asked him how long. The question hung between them, quiet but charged. He didn't answer immediately, and that delay told her everything she needed to know. She replayed the past months in her mind, the moment she'd brushed off as coincidence, the time she'd felt watched only to dismiss it as paranoia, a glance held a second too long, a presence she couldn't quite place, small encounters that now took on a different shape. The room seemed smaller as the implications settled in. She realized that her isolation, the very thing she thought made her invisible, had made her stand out to someone like him. In a world full of noise and ambition, her quiet had been noticeable. When he finally spoke, he didn't deny it. He simply said he paid attention to things others overlooked. That answer confirmed her suspicion and deepened the mystery all at once. She wasn't just a random choice on a lonely night. She was part of a pattern she didn't yet understand, a decision made with intent rather than impulse. As the truth settled in, she understood that agreeing to come here had connected her to a story that began long before the new year arrived, and whatever he saw in her, it was something he'd been watching, waiting for, far longer than she'd ever imagined. The house itself felt too quiet for a night like this, but it was the people inside it who made the silence heavy. She noticed it first in the way the staff moved, not hurried, not nervous in the obvious way, but precise, careful, as if every step had already been measured. They spoke softly even when there was no need to whisper, eyes lowering the moment he entered a room, backs straightening without being told. It wasn't respect born from kindness, she realized. It was discipline learned over time. The kind that came from knowing exactly what happened when rules were broken. She had heard stories about men like him before, whispered warnings passed around late at night, but seeing it in motion was different. No raised voice, no visible threat, yet the entire space bent around his presence. He didn't have to announce himself. The room knew when he was there. As they walked deeper into the house, she caught fragments of conversation from the staff, cut short the moment he appeared, expressions smoothing into something neutral and unreadable. It struck her then that this wasn't a home meant for comfort on nights like New Year's. It was a command center disguised by warmth, a place where power slept lightly and never fully rested. She'd expected extravagance, noise, signs of celebration, but instead she found restraint, control, and an undercurrent of tension that never quite left the air. Even the decorations felt deliberate, tasteful lights arranged perfectly, a table set as if for an audience that never arrived. He offered her a seat, his manners almost gentle, and that contrast unsettled her more than arrogance ever could have. Men who needed to prove themselves were loud. Men who already held power didn't need to be. As she sat, she began to understand why his name carried weight far beyond the walls of this house. Power followed him quietly, the way a shadow followed light. It didn't announce itself, but it was always there. She asked carefully if his family would be joining them, if there were others coming for the celebration. The question seemed harmless, polite, but the pause that followed made her chest tighten. He answered simply that everyone was where they needed to be tonight. Not celebrating, not resting, but positioned. That single word told her more than a long explanation ever could. New Year's Eve for most people was about endings and beginnings, but for him it was about timing. She could feel it now, the sense that he wasn't here to toast the future. He was waiting for something to happen. She noticed the subtle checks, the glance at his phone that lasted half a second too long, the way he listened even when nothing seemed to be said. Somewhere beyond the walls of this house, things were moving, and he was at the center of it whether he acknowledged it or not. The warmth of the room clashed with the knowledge that danger didn't take holidays, and that men like him never truly stepped away from their world. She wondered what it must be like to live like that, always alert, always prepared, even when the world insisted on celebration. The staff moved again, bringing drinks she hadn't asked for, placing them just so, retreating without a word. No one asked if she was comfortable. Comfort was assumed or irrelevant. And yet, he asked her quietly if she was warm enough, if she needed anything. That small act of consideration confused her more than cruelty would have. It was easier to understand monsters who acted like monsters. It was harder to understand men who balanced menace with restraint so seamlessly. She began to sense that whatever reputation followed him, it wasn't built on chaos, but on control. The kind of control that allowed him to sit calmly while others trembled in anticipation of his decisions. Outside, fireworks began to crack in the distance, muted by thick glass and walls designed to keep the world out. The sound felt wrong here, almost intrusive. She realized that while the city counted down to midnight, his attention was fixed elsewhere, on a clock no one else could see. When his phone finally vibrated, The shift in the room was immediate, though barely perceptible. The staff froze for a fraction of a second before resuming their movements with even more care. He looked at the screen, his expression unchanged, but she saw his jaw tighten just enough to notice. Whatever message he'd received mattered. He didn't explain, didn't offer reassurance, but the warmth she'd felt earlier receded slightly, replaced by something sharper. The contrast made her pulse quicken. This was the man everyone feared, not because he shouted or threatened, but because when warnings came, he listened, and when he acted, there were consequences. As the final minutes before midnight approached, she understood that this night was never meant to be simple, and when a quiet warning arrived just before the new year, she knew that whatever was coming next would change the meaning of this invitation forever. The countdown had started somewhere beyond the walls, faint voices drifting in through the glass, a distant rhythm of excitement that didn't belong to this house. A large digital clock glowed softly near the main hall, its numbers slipping steadily toward midnight. She watched it without meaning to, feeling the strange pull of time narrowing, as if something was being compressed into those final seconds. Staff moved with quiet urgency now, no longer pretending this was a normal evening. Phones were checked discreetly. Doors were secured with a little more care. The warmth she had felt earlier thinned, replaced by an alertness that hummed just beneath the surface. When she looked at him, she saw that he wasn't watching the clock at all. His attention was turned inward, focused on information she didn't have access to, decisions being made in silence. The celebration she expected never arrived. Instead, the air grew tight, charged with anticipation that had nothing to do with fireworks. Just as the countdown reached its final 10 seconds, a sound cut through the room, not loud enough to startle, but sharp enough to command attention. A phone vibrated against the table. Then another. Conversations stopped completely. The last numbers ticked down unheard. Midnight came and went without a cheer, without a toast, without anyone acknowledging it. The new year arrived quietly, swallowed by whatever message had just landed. He read his screen once, then again, his face unreadable, his calm intact in a way that felt unnatural. She realized then that this was the real reason he'd invited her here. Not for celebration, not for company, but because something was about to unfold, and she was already inside it. He stood, movement smooth and unhurried, and the room seemed to reorient around him. Orders were given without raising his voice, gestures subtle but decisive. The staff responded instantly, dispersing like pieces on a board being repositioned for an endgame. She remained seated, unsure whether to move or stay still, her pulse loud in her ears. The sense of being trapped settled in slowly, not as panic, but as a heavy awareness that there was no easy exit from this situation. Whatever threat had emerged, it wasn't coming from outside alone. She caught fragments of words, coded phrases that meant nothing to her but carried weight for everyone else. Betrayal, taming, internal failure. The danger wasn't faceless. It had a name, a history, and proximity. She felt a cold realization settle in that this house, for all its security, had just become a focal point. He turned to her then, and for the first time since she arrived, his calm shifted slightly, not into fear, but into focus sharpened by necessity. He told her to stand, to stay near him, his tone firm but not unkind. There was no explanation, no reassurance beyond the steadiness of his voice. She wanted to ask what was happening, wanted to understand why the new year had begun with tension instead of hope, but something in his expression told her questions would only slow things down. A door opened somewhere down the hall, footsteps quick but controlled, a whispered exchange that ended abruptly. She felt the walls closing in, the luxury of the space now feeling like a cage designed to keep both danger and safety locked together. Outside, fireworks finally burst into the sky, their muffled explosions casting flickers of light through the windows. The contrast was unsettling, beauty and chaos unfolding simultaneously, the city celebrating while this house prepared for something far more dangerous. He positioned himself slightly in front of her, not touching, but close enough that she understood the message. whatever was coming. He intended to control it, and her place was within his orbit whether she liked it or not. She noticed then how still he was, how his breathing never changed, how his eyes tracked every movement in the room with quiet precision. This was the version of him the stories were built on, not dramatic or cruel, but terrifying in his restraint. When another message arrived, he didn't read it aloud. He simply closed his phone and looked at her, meeting her gaze fully for the first time since midnight passed. The weight of that look pressed into her chest, not with threat, but with warning. He leaned in just enough that only she could hear him, his voice low and steady, telling her to stay close and not ask questions, not because she didn't deserve answers, but because answers would come later if they both made it through the night. In that moment, she understood that the invitation had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and whatever darkness had followed the new year in, it had already decided she was part of the story now. The house no longer felt like a place meant to shelter anything. It felt exposed, every hallway suddenly a passage, every door a decision point. She stayed close to him as he moved, not because he demanded it, but because the space itself seemed to pull her toward the calm at his center. What she saw next didn't come in flashes of chaos or loud confrontation. It came in fragments, moments stitched together by silence. A man stepped out of a side corridor, his posture wrong, his eyes avoiding direct contact. He spoke softly, too softly, words meant only for the boss. There was no argument, no raised voice. Just a pause, long enough to let the truth hang in the air, and then a single nod. Two others appeared, escorting the man away without force, without explanation. The efficiency of it unsettled her more than violence ever could. She realized then that this was how power really worked here, not through spectacle but through inevitability. She followed as he continued deeper into the house, observing how people responded to him instinctively, not waiting for instruction, anticipating his needs. This wasn't fear born from unpredictability. It was fear shaped by consistency, by knowing exactly what he was capable of and trusting that he would act when necessary. She caught glimpses of rooms she hadn't seen before, spaces that felt less like living areas and more like nerve centers. Screens flickered briefly before being shut off as they passed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. It was as if the house itself adjusted its behavior in his presence. She realized she was witnessing his world not as an outsider peering in from safety, but as someone allowed to stand close enough to feel its weight. Another man approached, his voice low, urgent, delivering information in clipped phrases. Betrayal confirmed. The threat contained for now. He listened without interruption, absorbing details, then dismissed the man with a subtle gesture. She noticed how no one questioned his decisions, how trust flowed in one direction without resistance. And yet, despite being surrounded by men trained to protect him, it was her he kept closest. The realization crept in slowly, unsettling and undeniable. He trusted her presence more than theirs. Not because she was stronger or more dangerous, but because she represented something different. She wasn't part of this machinery. She hadn't been shaped by it. And that, she sensed, was precisely why he wanted her there. She saw it clearly when another potential threat was handled just as quietly as the first. A phone call, a door closing, a problem removed without a trace. No blood, no shouting, just absence, the kind that spoke volumes. She thought of all the stories she'd heard, all the rumors exaggerated by fear and fascination, and realized the truth was more complex. This wasn't a man who thrived on violence. This was a man who understood it as a tool, used sparingly and without emotion. The moral tension twisted inside her as she watched, torn between relief at the control and discomfort at the implications. She began to understand why he had brought her here, why he'd insisted she stay close. It wasn't protection alone. It was grounding. In a world where loyalty was transactional and intentions were always suspect, her presence was a reminder of something untainted. Someone who could see what he did and still react honestly. Someone whose silence wasn't bought or enforced. He glanced at her then, just briefly, as if checking whether she was still there, still steady. Their eyes met, and in that moment, she felt the unspoken agreement forming. She would witness, not interfere. She would see, not judge. And in return, he would not pretend this world was something it wasn't. The weight of that understanding settled heavily on her shoulders. She realized that the invitation hadn't been about loneliness or chance. It had been deliberate, calculated, rooted in a need he couldn't satisfy with the men who surrounded him. He needed someone who wasn't afraid to see him clearly. As the house slowly returned to its controlled quiet, she felt a shift within herself. The fear she'd carried since midnight transformed into something else, a sober awareness of where she stood and why. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't bait. She was a witness. And as that truth settled in, she understood with unsettling clarity that she hadn't been invited by accident, and whatever came next would hinge on the fact that she now knew exactly who he was when no one was watching. The tension in the house eased, but it didn't disappear. It settled instead, like dust after a storm, visible only if you looked closely. He poured 2 glasses without asking, the movement unhurried, deliberate, as if this were just another quiet moment rather than the aftermath of something dangerous. She accepted the glass, not because she wanted it, but because refusing felt like rejecting the fragile calm that had finally taken hold. They stood near the window, fireworks still blooming faintly in the distance, their colors muted by the thick glass and the weight of what had almost happened. For the first time since she arrived, he spoke without purpose tied to command or control. He spoke slowly, choosing his words as if they mattered. He told her that New Year's had never been about celebration for him. Not really. It was a marker, a reminder of time passing whether you were ready or not. A night when people counted blessings while he counted losses. He didn't list them, didn't name names, but she felt the shape of them in his pauses, in the way his eyes drifted briefly to places that held memory rather than meaning. He spoke of a childhood where holidays were brief interruptions between survival, where silence was safer than laughter and trust was something learned too late. As his world grew, so did the distance between him and anything that felt real. People surrounded him constantly, yet none of them were there for him. They came for protection, for favor, for status, for fear. Never for the man underneath. He admitted that loneliness wasn't loud in his life. Didn't scream. It waited. It showed up on nights like this, when the world expected joy and he felt nothing but the weight of everything he'd built and everything it had cost. She listened, not interrupting, sensing that this wasn't confession but release. He explained that New Year's was dangerous for men like him, not because of enemies alone, but because reflection was unavoidable. You couldn't outrun the calendar. You couldn't negotiate with time. And every year it asked the same question he avoided answering. Was any of this worth it? He glanced at her then, meeting her gaze fully, and told her that she reminded him of a life untouched by performance. Someone who hadn't learned to hide behind power or violence or control. Someone who still reacted honestly, even when afraid. That was why he needed her there. Not as protection, not as distraction, but as a mirror. Someone real enough to ground him in a moment when everything else threatened to pull him back into instinct and isolation. The vulnerability in his voice never crossed into weakness. It remained contained, disciplined, but unmistakably human. She felt the shift in the room, the space between them no longer defined by fear or curiosity but by something heavier and more intimate. Understanding. She thought about her own reasons for being there. About the loneliness she'd confessed earlier, and realized how different yet similar their isolation was. 2 people standing on opposite sides of power, both disconnected in ways no celebration could fix. The fireworks outside faded, replaced by the quiet hum of the city settling into the new year. She studied him then, not as the man everyone feared, but as the man standing alone on a night that demanded reflection. And in that stillness, something inside her settled enough for courage to rise. She asked him a question she hadn't planned, a question that felt dangerous not because of his temper, but because of its honesty. She asked him if he ever wished he could step away from it all, if there was a version of his life where New Year's didn't feel like a reckoning. The question landed softly, but its weight was undeniable. For a moment he didn't respond. The silence stretched, thick with the knowledge that no one had ever asked him that without expectation or fear. She saw something shift behind his eyes, not anger, not threat, but surprise. And in that pause, she understood that she had crossed a line no one else had dared to approach, a line that would change what came next whether either of them was ready for it or not. He didn't answer her question right away. Instead, he set his glass down and turned fully toward her, the city lights reflecting faintly in his eyes. The shift was subtle, but she felt it immediately. This wasn't the posture of a man preparing to command. It was the stillness of someone stepping back. He told her that whatever had brought her here had already run its course, that the danger had passed, and that she was free to leave if she wanted. No escort demanded. No explanation required. He would have a car ready, take her wherever she asked, and the night would end without consequence. The words landed with unexpected weight. For the first time since midnight, she wasn't reacting to circumstances he controlled. She was being given space to decide. The absence of pressure unsettled her more than force ever could. She'd learned to recognize manipulation, to feel it closing in long before it spoke, but this felt different. He didn't dress the offer in persuasion or promise. He simply laid it out and waited. She moved slowly, walking a few steps away, letting the room breathe around her as she considered what leaving would mean. Safety. Distance. A return to the quiet loneliness she knew how to manage. She thought about the fear she'd carried earlier, the unease that still lingered, and weighed it against the clarity she'd found here. Staying meant proximity to a world that thrived on danger and consequence. It meant accepting that she'd seen too much to pretend this was just a strange holiday invitation. But it also meant choosing truth over comfort. Choosing awareness over ignorance. She turned back to him and studied his face, searching for signs of expectation, of subtle influence. She found none. He wasn't testing her loyalty or seeking validation. He was offering something rare in his world. Agency. She realized then that respect had quietly replaced control between them. He trusted her not to be swayed by fear or flattery, and that trust carried its own gravity. She spoke aloud, not to him at first, but to herself, acknowledging the fear that still sat in her chest, the part of her that wanted to run simply because running felt safer. She admitted that leaving would be easier. But easy had never been what changed her life for the better. She told him that she didn't stay out of obligation or curiosity, but because she refused to let fear make the decision for her. The admission surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. She took a breath and made her choice, not framed as defiance or surrender, but as intention. She would stay, not because she belonged in his world, but because she wanted to understand it on her own terms. Because walking away without asking her own questions felt like another form of silence she'd grown tired of carrying. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, but something in his stance softened, just enough to signal that her choice mattered. He nodded once, acknowledging her decision without triumph or relief. The room seemed to settle again, tension rearranging itself rather than dissolving. She felt the weight of what she'd chosen, the awareness that this decision would ripple outward in ways she couldn't yet see. Yet beneath the uncertainty was a steadiness she hadn't expected. The sense that whatever came next would be faced openly, not hidden behind half-truths or power plays. As they stood there, the night deepened, the new year fully underway. She realized that the unexpected choice she'd made wasn't about him at all. It was about herself. About refusing to be moved by fear alone. And as the quiet stretched between them, she understood that by choosing to stay, she had altered the shape of the story in a way neither of them could undo. The house breathed again. Not in relief exactly, but in acceptance. The kind that followed certainty. Whatever threat had hovered at the edge of the night had been resolved elsewhere, quietly and completely, and the echoes of tension faded into the corners of the rooms. Staff moved with less restraint now, their steps softer, conversations returning in low murmurs. Doors that had remained shut reopened, and the careful stillness gave way to a controlled calm. She felt it in her own body, the way her shoulders loosened, the way her breathing slowed as the danger receded. Midnight had passed some time ago, and with it the sharp edge of anticipation. What remained was reflection. They sat across from each other in a smaller room, away from the hallways and surveillance, a space that felt less like a fortress and more like a pause. No one interrupted. No one hovered. It was just the two of them, the quiet stretching without urgency. She replayed the night in her mind, the invitation, the locked doors, the warnings, the choices. It felt unreal in hindsight, compressed into something that had altered her perspective more than she expected. She realized that fear hadn't defined her experience in the end. Awareness had. Seeing how his world functioned stripped away the mystique and replaced it with understanding, not comfort but clarity. He watched her process in silence, his gaze attentive but unintrusive. The man who commanded rooms had learned when not to speak. He finally broke the quiet, not with explanation but with observation. He told her that nights like this usually ended with him alone, sitting in the aftermath of decisions no one else ever witnessed. That this time felt different, not easier but honest. He acknowledged that her presence hadn't softened the reality of his world, but it had changed how he moved through it, even briefly. She responded carefully, admitting that she didn't feel rescued or overwhelmed, just changed. The night had forced her to confront her own boundaries, her instinct to withdraw when faced with complexity. She told him that staying hadn't been about bravery, but about refusing to leave questions unanswered. The exchange felt balanced, neither of them reaching for something the other couldn't give. There was no fantasy layered over the moment, no illusion of transformation beyond what had already occurred. Just two people taking stock of what had shifted. The fireworks had long since faded, leaving the city in a reflective hush that mirrored the mood inside the house. She stood and walked to the window again, watching the lights below, thinking about how quickly a year could change direction. He joined her, not close enough to crowd her, but near enough to share the view. After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice lower, stripped of the authority she'd grown used to hearing. He admitted something he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. That control, for all its necessity, had cost him more than he'd ever accounted for. That nights like this reminded him how little space he'd left for anything unscripted, anything real. He said that inviting her had been a risk, not to his safety but to his certainty. Saying it aloud felt dangerous in a way violence never did. She didn't respond immediately, sensing the weight of the confession. When she did, it wasn't to reassure or challenge, but to recognize the truth in it. The quiet between them felt earned, not empty. And as the house settled fully into the new year, she understood that the night had left marks on both of them, subtle but lasting, setting the stage for something that neither of them had anticipated when the invitation was first spoken. Morning arrived without ceremony. No alarms, no announcements, no dramatic shift in the house's rhythm. Light crept in slowly, pale and unassuming, slipping through the tall windows and softening the edges of everything it touched. The city outside looked different in daylight, less intimidating, more ordinary, as if the night had been something imagined. She stood quietly, watching the world wake up, feeling the weight of what had passed settle into something more permanent. The danger was gone, not erased, but concluded, folded back into the invisible systems that governed his life. What lingered wasn't fear. It was clarity. She realized that whatever this invitation had been, it was never about the new year itself. It was about a pause in time, a moment where choices were made without spectacle. He appeared behind her without sound, the same calm presence she'd grown accustomed to, but there was something different now. Less guarded, less performative. The night had stripped away unnecessary layers, leaving only what mattered. He told her the car was ready, that she could go whenever she wanted. There was no urgency in his voice, no expectation attached to the offer. It was simply information, delivered with the same respect he'd shown since giving her the choice. She nodded, absorbing the finality of it. Leaving didn't feel like retreat. Felt like continuation. She thought about how her life had shifted in subtle ways already, not because she'd been pulled into his world, but because she'd seen it clearly and chosen her own position within it. She understood now that power wasn't always loud or forceful. Sometimes it was restraint. The ability to step back when stepping forward would have been easier. She gathered her things slowly, taking one last look around the house that had held so much tension and truth in the span of a single night. He walked her to the door, stopping just short of crossing the threshold. That boundary mattered. It was intentional. As she turned to face him, she realized that whatever connection existed between them didn't need naming. It wasn't romance, not in the way stories like to frame it. It was recognition, mutual awareness forged under pressure. He told her that the invitation had been his way of remembering something he'd almost lost. Not innocence, not hope, perspective. He said that having someone there who wasn't tied to his world, who could see him without fear or ambition, had grounded him in a way nothing else could. She listened, understanding that this wasn't an apology or a promise. It was acknowledgement. She responded simply, telling him that the night had taught her the difference between danger and intention, and that she wouldn't forget it. The door opened, cool morning air rushing in, carrying the quiet promise of a year just beginning. She stepped outside, feeling the shift immediately. The world resumed its scale, vast and indifferent, yet somehow more navigable. As the car pulled away, she looked back once, seeing him framed in the doorway, already receding into the controlled distance that defined his life. She didn't feel sadness. She felt resolved. The invitation had given her something she hadn't expected. Not protection. Not escape. Understanding. She carried that with her as the city unfolded ahead, knowing her path would change not because of who he was, but because of what she'd learned about herself in his presence. And as the house disappeared from view, she understood the truth behind the quiet weight of the night. She had come expecting a celebration. She left understanding why he never celebrated at all. If you believe that true strength comes from within, not from what others see on the outside, subscribe to our channel right now and share where you're watching from. Only those who judge without knowing would turn away from this truth.